Hey, thanks for clicking on this video. In our Tab 400 camper, the table sticks out just a little too far and it's a little wider than we'd like. So I'm going to go ahead and downsize it and give it a custom spin. So let's go ahead and get into it. So I'm starting with a standard piece of underlayment I got for $7 off a discount rack. I'm always looking for a good deal. And it's got a small crack, but that won't affect this build. So then I made this cardboard template and I went ahead and traced that design onto the panel. After that, I used a circular saw and cut it down into two manageable pieces. Then I took those over to the bandsaw and trimmed them out. I should have swapped out my blade. 3/4 couldn't quite make that radius, but I was being lazy. After that, I moved over to the sander and used that to trim everything down right to the pencil line and refine that shape. It made pretty quick work of it. So then I milled down some ash to 7/8 of an inch thick. The original table was 1.5 inches thick, and I'm sticking with that. So between the two underlay panels and this 7/8 inch thick layer of ash, along with a 1/4 inch layer of hardwood I'm going to put on the surface, that builds it up to 1.5 inches. It took quite a bit of dry fitting and trimming to get these pieces all set, but I'm building the solid wood perimeter on the outside of the table. So a whole pile of clamps later, here it is. Then I also added another square of 7/8 inch thick ash where the leg mounts into the table. That way the screws have some solid wood to screw into. Then I cut a bunch of 7/8 inch wide strips out of that same underlay. I notched it so that I could fit them together in a crisscross design. I'm trying to make basically a hollow core table, so that way it maintains as much strength as possible but isn't super heavy. This part ended up being a lot more frustrating than I had anticipated, but I eventually figured out that I used just a dab of CA glue at each joint as I pieced it together. It made it way easier. I trimmed it out with a bandsaw, and here's what I ended up with. And yet another bargain find. Walmart was selling this pre-colored epoxy for $6. Apparently nobody wanted the colored stuff. For this application, going on the inside of the table, since I'm going to epoxy the gridwork inside it versus glue, this turned out to be a great deal. So brown it is for $6. After I made somewhat of a mess with the epoxy, I went ahead and stuck the other panel on top, clamped it down, put anything heavy I could find on top of it, and waited a day for the epoxy to set up. And now a day later, the epoxy is set up, and here's my interior panel. Then I went ahead and used a flush trim bit and cut the ash sides down to match the panels on the perimeter. And for the surface layer, I'm using some beech. This was actually some firewood that I was cutting up last year that I found some spalting in. So I milled it down to 1.5 inches thick and left it sit through the winter. Now I've resawn that and planed it down to 1/4 inch thick, and this is what I came up with. And then my wife got more involved, and we decided to fancy it up a little bit more by adding some mountains out of walnut and hard maple at the bottom of the table. And then up higher, the word explore in a cursive font is going to be inlaid into the table. After getting the panels glued down, I went ahead and tried to get the letters centered into the opening the best I could. I used some CA glue to mount it. I cut all this out on a laser. I only have a 5-watt laser. It did fine on the letters, but when I cut out the inlay opening, it took probably 2 hours to cut through this hardwood. It's not a very powerful laser. With that done, I was able to go back to the router with a flush trim bit and trim the edge down so that it was flush with the rest of the table. Then I milled down a thin strip of cherry. It's about 1/8 of an inch thick and 1 3/4 inches wide. It's pliable enough where it'll wrap around this table without cracking. I glued one side down. I forgot to hit record, but here I am wrapping the rest of the side around using a pile of clamps. I should have probably made an MDF form for gluing purposes, but I was being lazy. Once the glue was dry, I grabbed a handheld belt sander and I flushed up the surface. I didn't want to use a flush trim bit because I was afraid I would put a divot around where the groove in the mountain is. After that, I went back to my $6 budget epoxy, and I filled in all the gaps in between the mountains and the lettering. And then I used some blue stain I had left over from a previous project. It was a bit tedious and time consuming, but it really looked neat when I get done, and it makes the word explore really pop. Then I taped the outside perimeter of cherry with some box tape. I'm putting tabletop epoxy on this, and it's really hard to keep it even on a vertical surface like that. So I'm just going to try to do my best to keep it on the top. I spread it out. I spent about an hour torching it lightly to get all the air bubbles out I could, and then I just waited for it to cure. And now it's been a couple days, and I'm just putting some tung oil finish around the outside cherry edge. I'll put a few coats on the bottom and the sides. There is a square plastic base plate on the original table that is about a ½ inch thick. I'll make one out of ash, but I don't want it square because I don't want corners on it that your knee may hit. So I'm going to make it oval, and I'll just give it a light round over and glue it down to the table with some regular wood glue and a little bit of CA glue. One more coat of tung oil on the bottom and the sides, and this thing's almost done. And here's a few glamour shots of what it looks like before I have it installed in the camera. A couple little oohs and ahs. Lastly, I pulled the hardware off the old table, and I'm installing that hardware on the new table, and this thing's finally ready to go in the camper. And here it is, the final reveal of it finally installed in the camper, and I hope you like it. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you're inspired to go make something. Thanks for watching. Please consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.